Hey everybody, it's Gavin. I'm excited to share with you guys today the project I decided to do. I decided to look at pharmaceutical spending as a whole, how it's increased year over year for each country. I decided to do this because I worked in the pharmaceutical field for 7 years and I've seen all the costs associated with it. And I luckily have been able to work in the healthcare sector for the past 3 years and I've seen all those costs. So I've always wanted to kind of look and see how these are correlated or not correlated. I used two data sources and three data points from between the two. For World Bank, I got the population totals by country, and I had to gather that data from them because the data.oecd.org for my healthcare spending and pharmacy spending gives me it per capita. One thing I thought was interesting is there's no actual dollar amount for pharmaceutical spending, it's just a percentage. I thought that was kind of interesting. I started this with two key assumptions that pharmacy spending and population aren't correlated. I believe this is because there's no regulations on pharmacy benefit managers or drug manufacturers in the pharmacy sector. The same can be held true with the healthcare sector. Being the custodian of all that data, I see the nuisances of how data is invalid, isn't supplied correctly, but it's kind of, we live in a world where people just want their claims paid and they want the data to go through and they want it to be nice, but no one's kind of stepped in and said, here's our standard of what we need to do. The second key assumption I had is that we'll see the pharmacy cost increase year over year, but we won't see the standard deviation of the percentage jump up as much as the pharmacy costs will. I think those will be pretty consistent. Just a real quick overview. I use Pandas. I like the way how you can load a data frame, and I also like how you can use it with Plotly. I like their visuals because you can dive in and dissect the data a little bit more. So basically, that's the packages I use. Obviously, use MySQL. The first portion of what I did is I just created the country tables for all my data sets. Show you that worked. I created the country lookup, so when you look at the data, you have the country code and the country name, but I thought it would be nice to actually show the country name. One thing I want to show with how I process the data, since we've all pretty much done this with SQLite, it's pretty simple, it's pretty much the same. But with how the data comes in through my data sources, with healthcare spending and pharmacy percentage, it's nice and uniform. I get a single header and it gives me each of my data points right here. So here's the country code, the year, and the value associated to it. The population per country was a little bit different. My row data I was looking to get was actually in the headers, so I had to do a little bit of finesse in Python to actually get the data in a nice uniform way to do the aggregation, which is what I did here. So basically I said I'm going to loop through the cost percentage list, and then finally I'm going to loop through the country population, and from there I say if the country codes equal each other and the year in the cost percentage list is 2000 and so forth for each year to make sure I got the right value, I would just grab the population value and then the total cost, which I calculated and did here. Last thing I did once I got my final dictionary is I inserted into my final table, which you can see here. I obviously had to cast the cost as a float to get those to insert correctly. Last thing I did from there to start my analysis, I loaded into the Pandas data frame, which is really nice. It's really simple. You can see the data types here. I did some formatting to get them integers versus the objects they originally came in. Here's where we get to the fun part and why I like Plotly is the first thing I did was I wanted to look at the pharmaceutical spending by a year and total population. I did a scatter plot to get that correlation. From the correlation, we can see the majority of the data lives here, so it doesn't really look like it's correlated yet. We can see here that the United States has the highest population. This is obviously, we know India has a bigger population, but they didn't provide us with pharmaceutical spending, so I omitted them. The next thing I did was I wanted to get the average pharmacy cost year over year, which I did here. You can see the United States has the highest, the second's Japan, then Germany, then Russia, then Germany, then France. Why I did this was so I could get the top 5 to dive in a little bit deeper to the data. So when we come here, I had to create my filters for my data frame just so I could get the scatters and traces to work correctly. So that's all the fun stuff we're doing here. And then from there we get our total costs, total pharmacy costs here, and then our total population here. So we can see that here's the United States, you can see the dip here, here's Japan, Germany, and etc. So we get a little bit of insights here on We can obviously see the United States has jumped up the most from everybody, and it's linear with their population, which goes against our hypothesis, which is fine. We'll look into that a little bit deeper. Next thing I looked at was pharmacy costs versus pharmacy spending, which we'll see here. We see our data here, and we can see here's the United States up here, but what's interesting here is their actual pharmacy spending through everybody's consistent, but the United States is the lowest of our top 5, which I thought was interesting. Last thing I looked at is here's total pharmacy costs and total healthcare spending. We can see the US is increased drastically, where everybody else is increased, but it's pretty linear rate, which I thought was interesting, which kind of leads us to our conclusions is total pharmaceutical spending is actually correlated with population total. I believe that had I not scrubbed out the data that didn't have pharmacy percentages, we would actually see that the US has a lower population than a lot of these countries that were omitted, but their healthcare costs are still rising, obviously. The other thing I was able to prove from this was that the cost did increase, but the standard deviation and the increase of each percentage of pharmacy spending was actually really consistent. One thing I wanted to point out is I think had we gotten those other pharmacy points from these other bigger countries, I don't think the US would be as big as it was. It would still be an outlier, and I think they spend the most on healthcare costs, and I think that's just what we are as a nation. We spend a whole lot on that. The third thing I noticed is that regardless of scrubbing out that other data, that the U.S. healthcare cost is increasing at a drastic rate compared to everybody else, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed, and I think it shows in multiple areas that our regulations aren't as strict as other countries may be, and that's why they're not devoting so much to healthcare. And basically, the last thing I think I would like to point out is to kind of clean up this data a little bit better, or to actually get a better picture of how pharmaceutical spending is, I would actually not omit people that didn't provide us with that information, but include it and have some more charts to show the healthcare spending between each country versus their population, in addition to the pharmaceutical spending. This kind of think both those things should really be looked at, and I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation as much as I enjoyed going through it. Thanks. Bye.